I've been working the night shift at the local 24-hour convenience store for almost a year now. It's one of those small, dusty stores on the outskirts of town where you don't get many customers after midnight. It's a lonely, quiet place, the kind of place where you start to feel like you're not alone even when you're the only one there. I remember the first night I worked the graveyard shift. The air was thick with unease. I didn't know what to expect, but the manager, Matt, told me it was easy. Just keep the place clean, lock the doors after the late customers, and make sure nothing suspicious happens. I laughed it off. Easy money, easy hours. It should have been that simple. But there was something off about the place. I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Around 2 a.m., the door chimes, signaling the arrival of a customer. I glance up from behind the counter to see a man in his mid-30s, tall, with a scruffy beard and an old baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He walks in slowly, almost as if he's floating. No other car in the parking lot. He was alone. "Can I help you?" I ask, trying to sound friendly but not too eager. He doesn't respond. He just walks past me without acknowledging my question and heads straight to the back aisle. It wasn't uncommon for some people to act strange during the night shift. Maybe sleep-deprived, maybe just avoiding interaction. But there was something different about this guy. I went back to my phone, scrolling absent-mindedly through social media. Suddenly, I hear the faintest scraping sound from the back. It's like metal on metal. I don't think much of it, maybe someone dropped something. But the sound is getting louder. I hesitate, but I pull myself up from the chair and walk towards the aisle. The man is standing there, staring at a shelf of canned goods. But it's the way he's standing that sends a chill down my spine. His body is stiff, unnaturally so, and he's staring intently at a can of beans. I clear my throat. "Everything okay?" I ask again, this time with more caution in my voice. He slowly turns his head, just enough for me to see his eyes. They're wide open, too wide, like someone who hasn't blinked in hours. His gaze locks onto mine, and for a moment, I swear he's looking right through me. He doesn't speak. Instead, he tilts his head slightly, almost like he's considering me. Then, without a word, he turns back to the shelves and picks up the can of beans, holding it in front of his face as though he's reading the label. His breathing is shallow, almost imperceptible. I back up, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. There's no reason for me to feel this way. It's just a guy shopping in the middle of the night. But I can't shake the feeling that something is terribly wrong. The lights flicker, and the room feels colder. The guy doesn't seem to notice. I glance at the clock. It's 3:15 a.m. time to close up soon. I decide to just finish this shift without making a big deal of it. I turn to walk back to the counter, and that's when I hear it. A soft whisper, like a breeze rustling through the air, but no windows are open. I turn back toward him. He's staring at me again, this time with a slight grin, barely noticeable, but it's there. "Can I help you with something?" I ask again, my voice trembling. He nods slowly, still grinning, and places the can on the counter. He walks out of the store without saying another word. I stand frozen for a moment, trying to shake off the unease. But I can't. I can't explain it. Something about him didn't feel right. He didn't leave like a normal customer would. Felt like something was waiting for me. Something was watching. I try to push it out of my mind, telling myself it's just my imagination. But when I glance down at the counter, I notice something strange. The can of beans he left behind. There's a handwritten note taped to the bottom. I flip it over. It says only one thing: "Look behind you." Suddenly, my blood runs cold. I look up, slowly, and there, in the reflection of the glass door, I see something that I can't explain. A figure standing just outside, barely visible in the dim light. But there's no one there when I turn around. That's when I realized this wasn't just some random customer. This was something far worse. And it wasn't over. It had just begun. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the empty parking lot outside. The figure was gone. I didn't know what to think. I felt the coldness in my spine creeping down my arms. It was as if the store itself had become a haunted place, and that note still burned in my mind. "Look behind you." I had to force myself to take a deep breath. It was just a prank, right? Maybe some sick joke from a regular customer. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something far worse. Something deliberate. My fingers trembled as I picked up the can of beans, inspecting the note again. It was written hastily, the letters jagged, as if someone had written it under extreme stress. There was no way it could have been from the man. He hadn't even said a word before he left. He hadn't even looked back. But it had to be from him, didn't it? I slowly placed the can back on the counter and moved to lock the front door, the rattle of the locks echoing through the stillness of the store. I was almost done with my shift. Just a few more hours and I could get out of this nightmare. But that was when the noise started. First, it was faint. A scratching sound, soft at first, like fingernails running against glass. I paused, listening. It was coming from the back. The storage room. I swallowed hard. There was no reason anyone would be in there. No one had come in for hours, and I was the only one working. The sound continued. A steady, relentless scrape. It was getting louder. I tried to ignore it. I had to. I wasn't about to go check the storage room alone at this hour. Maybe it was just something falling, maybe a rat. I could convince myself of that. But as I stood there, frozen, the sound didn't stop. In fact, it grew louder, more frantic, as if whatever was causing it was growing more desperate. I took one slow step toward the back hallway. I could feel my pulse quickening. I wanted to be brave, but the cold weight of fear in my chest was heavy, suffocating. I had to know what was going on back there. Couldn't leave not like this. The hallway to the storage room was dark, the flickering lights casting long, jagged shadows along the walls. My footsteps were muffled by the thick silence surrounding me. The closer I got to the room, the louder the scratching grew. My heart was racing in my chest. I reached for the handle of the storage room door. My hand shook, but I forced myself to grip it. Then, as my fingers wrapped around the cool metal, the scratching stopped. Everything went dead silent. For a moment, I stood there, the only sound my own breath. The cold air seemed to press in around me. I felt like I was being watched, like someone was right behind me. I turned to look, but there was no one, just shadows. I pushed open the door. The room was empty, save for stacks of boxes and a few scattered items. But something caught my eye, a small, rusted mirror leaning against the far wall. I hadn't noticed it before. I don't even know why I noticed it now. Maybe it was because it was the only thing out of place in this otherwise ordinary storage room. I moved closer, drawn to it. The mirror's surface was cracked in several places, but the glass was still mostly intact. The reflection, however, wasn't. It was my face, but something was wrong. My eyes, they were wide, too wide, just like the man from earlier. The same unsettling, blank expression. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew one thing. I needed to get out of here. I turned to leave the room, but as I stepped into the hallway, I felt it. Sudden, sharp chill, like someone had just walked past me. I whipped around, but no one was there. I tried to calm myself. My breath was shallow, panic creeping up on me again. I forced my legs to move toward the front of the store, praying that the night would just end. But when I reached the counter, the lights flickered one last time, and then the power went out. Complete darkness. It wasn't a gradual fade, but an immediate cut. The fluorescent lights above me hummed and then fell silent. For a moment, I couldn't move. My eyes darted around, trying to adjust to the blackness, but it felt like the shadows were closing in. There was a sharp ringing in my ears, as if the air itself was thick with static. Then I heard it. A voice. Soft, almost a whisper, coming from somewhere close by, just behind me. Look, behind you. I spun around, my heart racing, my breath caught in my throat. The man was back, but this time he was standing just inside the doorway, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. His eyes, wide and unblinking, stared straight through me, and in his hands he held a rusty old can of beans. His lips parted slightly, and he spoke in a voice that sent a chill down my spine. "It's time to play." I froze. The words made no sense. My body was locked in place, unable to move. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't. Then he smiled, and the lights flickered again. The smile on the man's face sent a wave of cold terror washing over me. It was wide and twisted, like a grin that didn't belong on a human face. The kind of smile you see in nightmares, right before everything goes horribly wrong. I stood frozen, heart pounding in my chest, unable to tear my eyes away from him. He didn't move. He just stood there, staring at me, waiting. I don't know how much time passed in that eerie silence. Seconds? Minutes? My mind was racing, trying to process what was happening. I wanted to scream, but my throat was dry, and no sound would come out. Then, as if on cue, the air in the room grew thick with something oppressive, something heavy. It felt like the walls were closing in, the shadows shifting, curling around the edges of my vision. The man took a single step forward. His eyes never left mine. "Do you like games?" he asked, his voice low and calm, but there was something deeply unsettling about it, like he knew what I was going to say before I even thought it. I didn't know how to respond. My body screamed at me to run, but my feet wouldn't obey. I was trapped in this nightmare, this suffocating moment. "I didn't ask if you wanted to play," he continued, his voice now strangely sweet, almost childlike. "I asked if you liked them." Before I could react, the store lights flickered once more, then went completely dark again. The blackness felt alive, like it was watching me, pressing in on all sides. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, louder than ever, as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. The man's voice cut through the darkness, closer now. He was right behind me. I could feel his breath on my neck, cold and stale. "You have to play," he whispered, a hint of excitement in his voice. "You have no choice." My skin prickled. I spun around, desperate to escape, but the store was gone. The aisles were distorted, twisted in ways I couldn't comprehend. The walls were breathing. "Play the game," the man said again, his form now flickering in and out of existence like a shadow dancing in a flame. "Do you want to live?" The question sent a jolt of fear through me. I couldn't speak. I wanted to scream, to shout, but my mouth was dry, my body immobilized. I felt as if I was drowning in the darkness that surrounded me. Suddenly, the fluorescent lights blinked back to life, but they weren't right. They flickered wildly, casting erratic shadows that seemed to move and shift with a life of their own. The shelves were gone, replaced by strange objects, old toys, worn-out books, and jars filled with strange, unidentifiable things. I could hear the faint sound of laughter, distant, echoing through the aisles. "Find the key," the man's voice called out, his voice warping into something monstrous. "Find the key, and you'll survive." Before I could understand what was happening, the lights flickered once again, and the store changed. I was no longer standing behind the counter. I was standing in the middle of the aisles, surrounded by walls that seemed to close in, the air thick with something foul. I felt like I was in some twisted version of the store, a reflection of reality that didn't quite make sense. The man's form appeared in front of me once more, grinning like a predator. "You're not alone here, you know," he said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "But it's too late for them. It's always too late for them." I didn't know who he was talking about, but a cold dread washed over me. I looked around, desperate to find an escape, but the walls kept shifting, expanding and contracting like a living organism. It felt like something was breathing behind the walls, watching, waiting. Suddenly, I heard a voice. "Help me." I whipped around, but saw nothing. The voice was weak, distant, but unmistakable, a cry for help. My breath caught in my throat. I tried to step forward, but the floor seemed to bend beneath my feet. The world around me was warping, contorting in unnatural ways. I couldn't tell where I was anymore. "Don't listen to them," the man said, his grin growing wider. "They're already gone. The game has already begun." The shadows around me seemed to grow longer, stretching like fingers, reaching out toward me. I couldn't tell if I was going insane or if this was real, but I could feel it, the heavy, suffocating presence closing in, like a spider tightening its web. I heard it again. Help me. It was louder now, closer. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw it. A shadow, a figure darting between the shelves. It wasn't the man. It wasn't him. It was something else. Something I couldn't comprehend. It was humanoid, but twisted. Its limbs contorted at impossible angles, dragging itself across the floor. I gasped, taking a step back, but the figure moved faster. The thing was coming for me. I turned to run, but the walls shifted, blocking my way. The air felt thick, like it was choking me. I was trapped. There was no escape. The man's voice echoed from all around me now. The game has only just begun. You have to play. You have to survive. I turned around to face him, but he wasn't there anymore. The store had become a maze, a labyrinth of shifting shadows. The thing was getting closer, its eyes glowing in the dark. The only thing I knew for sure was that I had to find the key. If I didn't want to think about it. I started running, not knowing where I was going. I could hear the thing behind me, dragging its broken body, getting closer with every step. I had no idea how long I ran. The walls twisted, the aisles stretched into infinity. But then, just as I was about to collapse from exhaustion, I saw it, the key. It was on the floor in the distance, glowing faintly in the darkness. Without thinking, I sprinted toward it, desperate, knowing that my survival depended on it. The moment my hand wrapped around the key, everything stopped. The darkness, the sounds, the distorted reality, everything froze. And then, the voice returned. You survived. This time, the man's form appeared before me, his grin still in place. But the game isn't over. Not yet. And I knew then this would never end. I stood there, the key clenched tightly in my hand, my body trembling, but I couldn't look away from the man. His grin, wide and unsettling, never wavered, as if it were carved into his face, something monstrous, unshakable. The air was thick, suffocating, and I could hear my heartbeat pounding in my ears, a deafening rhythm against the silence of this nightmare. I didn't know what to do. I had the key. I had escaped, or so I thought. But I knew deep down that nothing was over. You survived. For now. The man's voice echoed in the dark, each word hanging in the air like a curse. But the game continues. There's always another level. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg him to let me go, to just let me out of this twisted game. But no sound escaped my lips. It was like the world itself had muted me, forcing me into this awful silence. My eyes darted around, but everything looked the same. The distorted aisles, the endless darkness, the walls pressing in from all sides. I had no idea if I was even still in the store anymore. The world had stopped making sense. Was it a store? Was it a dream? Was it even real? It all blurred together. The only thing that remained certain was the oppressive feeling of being hunted, watched, trapped in a place that wasn't bound by time or logic. I stepped back, trying to find an exit, but there was none. The walls shifted again, their edges bleeding into the blackness like ink in water. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't a store. This wasn't a normal place. The game wasn't meant to end. You have to play, the man repeated, his voice echoing through my mind. It's the only way. I turned toward him, my mouth dry, my legs unsteady. The key felt heavy in my palm, almost like it was burning me, a constant reminder of the cruel game I was part of. Without warning, the ground beneath me trembled. The floor cracked, a deep rift opening right in front of me. I stumbled backward, instinctively, and as I did, the man's figure blurred, shifting between spaces, his presence warping like smoke in the air. I told you, he whispered, his voice now all around me, his words seeping into my brain. You can't escape. You can never escape. I tried to scream, but the words choked in my throat. I felt something rise within me, a primal, raw terror that I couldn't control. This wasn't just some prank or twisted illusion. It was real, and the reality of it gripped me with a bone-chilling finality. Suddenly, the ground stopped trembling, and the rift in the floor widened, stretching deeper into the abyss. And that's when I saw it. Something darker, something more terrible, something I wasn't meant to see. Pair of eyes. They were enormous, glowing a sickly yellow, peering out from the bottom of the rift. The eyes blinked, then focused on me, and I froze, my breath caught in my chest. These eyes were not human. They weren't even close. They belonged to something ancient, something that had been waiting, watching. I could feel the weight of its gaze. The air grew colder still. I knew I had to move, but I couldn't. The terror held me in place, rooting me to the spot. I tried to scream again, but the sound wouldn't come. "You belong to me now," the voice echoed from the abyss, the words dripping with malice. "You all belong to me." I backed up slowly, my feet stumbling over the cracked floor, but it felt like the walls were closing in on me faster now. The air was thick, suffocating, and that thing in the rift, it wasn't gonna let me leave. "You are part of the game now," the man's voice said from behind me, his form shifting in and out of view. I didn't know where he was anymore. "There's no getting out. Not for you. Not for anyone." I could feel my heart thundering in my chest. The game had changed. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about becoming part of whatever nightmare this was. And that's when I realized the horrible truth. I wasn't meant to win. I was meant to play forever. The rift in the floor widened further, and the eyes seemed to grow larger, more insistent, like it was pulling me in. Something deep inside me screamed for me to run, but I couldn't. I didn't know which way to go. There was no escape. The store wasn't just a store anymore. It was a trap, prison, and I had already played too long. I turned to run, but the walls were moving faster than I could. I could hear the sound of footsteps, hundreds of footsteps, echoing in the distance. A crowd, but there were no people. Just shadows moving, watching, waiting. They were all part of the game now. I sprinted, but the store was changing again. The aisles distorted in front of me, twisting, folding in on themselves. The shelves collapsed, crumbling into dust as I ran past. The floor itself seemed to shift beneath my feet, opening into cracks that swallowed anything in their path. The man's voice rang out one last time, a whisper that pierced through the chaos. "You can't leave. You can't win." I looked down at the key in my hand, the key that was supposed to open an exit. But there was no door, no way out. The shadows were closing in. The abyss was pulling me deeper. The game had no end. And that's when I understood. I was never going to survive this. I wasn't meant to. I was a piece in a never-ending game, trapped forever in the dark, with no way to escape. The key was useless, and I was just another lost player, waiting for the next round to begin. I ran. I ran as if my life depended on it. No, as if my very soul depended on it. Every step felt heavier, like the ground was pulling me down, trying to drag me back into the abyss. The walls shifted around me, their shapes warping and twisting into grotesque versions of themselves. The store, once familiar, had become an ever-changing maze, a living nightmare designed to trap me. The rift below me grew deeper with every passing second, its edge now brushing against my shoes, threatening to swallow me whole. The eyes, those horrendous yellow eyes, were still staring from the depths of that dark void, unblinking, unfeeling. They followed me, never losing focus, always watching. I could hear the man's laughter, distant but growing louder. His voice slithered through the walls, coiling around my thoughts. "You can't escape," he repeated. "You never could." I ignored the voice. I had to. There was no choice. If I stopped for even a second, I knew the game would catch me. The thing in the rift would pull me under, and I'd be lost forever. But as I turned a corner, I skidded to a stop. Ahead of me stood the man, not in the distance, but right in front of me, as though he had always been waiting. His grin stretched wider, impossibly so, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural hunger. "You've played long enough," he said, his voice almost gentle now, but filled with malice. "It's time to meet your fate." I felt a sudden weight on my chest, a crushing force that threatened to break me. The room spun around me, and I stumbled backward, my vision blurring. The walls were closing in. The shadows were crawling, slithering toward me, their shapes indistinct, shifting between reality and nightmare. I reached for the key, the only thing that had kept me tethered to this twisted version of the world. But as my fingers brushed it, I felt something shift in the air. The ground beneath me cracked open. Again, I fell into darkness. When I opened my eyes, I was back behind the counter. The familiar aisles, the shelves stocked with cheap snacks and drinks, the harsh fluorescent lights. Everything was just as it had been when I first started this nightmare of a shift. But something was wrong. The store was silent. Too silent. I stood up, the coldness in the air making my skin crawl. My breath was shallow, quick, as if I had been holding it for far too long. The key was still in my hand, but now it felt heavier, colder. I looked at it, confused. How had I gotten here? Why was I back at the beginning? That's when I heard it. A whisper, soft at first but growing louder. "You're late." I spun around, heart in my throat. There, standing in front of the door, was a figure. A man. His face was obscured by shadows, but I knew who it was. The same man. The one who had haunted my every step. His grin was still there, lurking beneath the darkness. "You should have known," he said, his voice now cold, emotionless. "You're part of the game now." I shook my head, disbelief rushing through me. "No, this can't be happening. This can't be real." "Real?" The man laughed, his voice distorted, mocking. "Oh, it's real. It's always been real. And you're never leaving. This is your life now. This is your fate." I wanted to scream. I wanted to run, to escape, to fight. But no matter where I turned, there was no exit, no way out. The store was no longer just a building. It was a prison, a twisted reflection of reality. I looked down at the key in my hand. It had once felt like a lifeline, the thing that would lead me to freedom. But now it felt like a cruel joke, a symbol of everything I couldn't escape. "Do you see now?" the man asked, his voice almost pitying. "You're part of the cycle. You always will be." I didn't understand. How could this be happening? How could I be back here? I had escaped. I had found the key. I had survived. But the truth was impossible to ignore. The game had no end. It only had beginnings, and I was trapped in it. Forever. I raised my eyes, looking at the door once more, the door that should have led me to the outside world. But now it stood frozen, sealed shut, its handle cold and unyielding. The man took a step forward, his eyes glowing in the dim light. "You're not the first to play, and you won't be the last." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath, to calm the panic rising in my chest. But I already knew the truth. The game was never over, and now I was the one who would have to play it forever. The room was suffocating. The store, once so mundane, had become something out of a nightmare, something unrecognizable. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, flickering like dying stars, casting grotesque shadows on the walls. The air was heavy with the stench of stale food and something darker, something that felt like decay. The man stood before me, his figure looming in the dim light, his smile widening with every passing second. It was as though his very presence warped reality, bending it to his will. He wasn't just a man anymore. He was the embodiment of the game, the force that controlled it all. "You think you can escape," he said softly, his voice almost tender, like he was explaining something to a child. "But there is no escape. Not for you. Not for anyone." I swallowed, trying to steady my racing heart. My hand gripped the key, now ice cold, almost burning against my palm. It felt like the weight of my existence, heavy and unrelenting. I had tried everything. I had run, I had fought, I had even tried to understand the rules of this twisted game. But nothing worked. "Why?" I choked out, the question tasting bitter in my mouth. "Why me?" The man tilted his head, his eyes gleaming with an unsettling amusement. "Why not you? You're just like the others. All of you are the same. You try to survive. You try to fight. But in the end, it's all part of the game. There's only one rule. I didn't want to hear it. I didn't want to know what his answer was, but I was already too far gone. What rule? I whispered, barely able to breathe. The smile grew wider, his face splitting in a grotesque, unnatural way. There is no winning. The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt the air leave my lungs, the weight of those words crashing down on me, suffocating me. There was no way out. No matter how hard I tried, no matter how much I begged, this would never end. I thought back to the moments I'd spent before this madness started, the customers, the laughter, the mundane routine of the night shift. It all seemed so insignificant now, so small. What had I been doing? What had I been living for? You think you have a choice? The man continued, his voice now low and mocking. But all you ever do is play. Play until the end. Play until your soul is gone. You will never leave. I will never let you leave. The room around me began to distort again, the walls breathing, shifting like the surface of a black ocean. The shelves bent and folded in on themselves. The floor cracked and crumbled like old paper. And then I saw it, the reflection in the broken glass of the door. It wasn't me, not anymore. The figure staring back was a distorted version of myself, a hollow-eyed, grinning thing. The eyes were wide, unblinking, filled with something dark and empty. The smile that stretched across my face was grotesque, mocking. It was no longer my reflection. It was the game. You're me? I whispered, the realization sinking in. You're the game. The man's form shimmered, the grin stretching impossibly wide, as if the very concept of smiling was warping. Exactly. I am the game, and you are part of it now. The key in my hand turned cold, colder than ever before. It felt like ice, like it was draining the warmth from my body, my soul. I wanted to drop it, to throw it away. But the moment I thought that, I realized I couldn't. I was the key. The key was me. I was the one trapped in this endless cycle, the one destined to play and play again until there was nothing left. No, I gasped, the terror rising in my chest. This can't be real. This can't. But then I saw it. The door. The one I had been fighting to reach. The exit. I turned and sprinted toward it, the key pulling me forward, as if it were leading me, begging me to open the door. I reached for the handle, my hand shaking, sweat pouring down my face. With trembling fingers, I gripped it. The door rattled slightly, as if it were alive. The man's laugh echoed from behind me. You think this is it? His voice was cold now, cutting through the silence. You think this will set you free? With one last desperate breath, I wrenched the door open, and then everything went dark. I opened my eyes. I was back behind the counter. The store, the aisles, the shelves, everything was exactly the same. The lights hummed above me, casting their harsh, sterile glow. But there was no sound. The air was thick with the weight of something wrong. The key was still in my hand. The game had begun again. I understood now. I understood what I had become. I was the player. I was the key. And I was the game. There was no escape. There would never be escape. And as I stared at the door, waiting for the next round to begin, I knew the truth. I would play forever.